So my name is Jeff Eisenach. I am the director of AEI's Center for Internet Communications and Technology Policy. Do we need to do anything with the webcast? Is there? We are getting rolling? Can you see us? Hello out there on the internet. That's what we're here to talk about today. And I want to start out with a few opening remarks. And then we're going to turn to a presentation by AEI Senior Fellow Richard Bennett on a major piece of research that Richard has recently done, and then we'll have some comments from four experts who I'll introduce presently. I'd like to start out, though, by saying, first of all, the number of people in the room today is a little less than it might be for some events, and the primary reason for that is that there is a debate going on across town about whether the internet should be treated as a public utility. And the remarkable thing about that is that that's an interesting topic today, that somebody thinks that that's a good idea. Indeed, a lot of people think that that's a good idea. The President of the United States thinks that that's a good idea. And there's a certain, for those of us, I think, who have been around the internet, a certain disconnection from reality. Maybe not so much the people who believe that. Well, I guess I do think they're disconnected from reality, but for those of us who thought we saw the world a different way, there is a sense of unreality about the fact that that debate is occurring and is being taken seriously. And not just that. We have today proposals on the table to end the decades-long moratorium on internet sales and to put in place a means for taxing sales that occur over the internet, including by small businesses. We have in place a proposal from the Federal Communications Commission and its chairman, also a proposal urged on the commission by the president to substantially raise taxes on broadband services in order to fund additional funding for public schools and libraries and access in those arenas. Now, that may or may not be money worth spending, but one would think that when there are multi-billion-dollar tax increases being considered, that the appropriate venue for that would be the Congress of the United States, not 5 unelected bureaucrats at the Federal Communications Commission, who do, in fact, appear to have the power to raise taxes by billions of dollars on their own say so. So proposals to regulate the internet, to tax the internet, are all around us these days. And it's where I think today's conversation comes in and is so important. Many of those proposals, all of them in one way or another, seem to be motivated by the notion that the internet is broken and needs government to step in and fix it. We've taken a different view of that. I've certainly taken a different view of that in the work that I've done. The fact of the matter is that the internet is the world's greatest free market success story. It has grown and prospered in a remarkably unregulated environment for 20 years. Interconnection on the internet has taken place without any government regulation, and often, if not almost always, by handshake, and has worked seamlessly and without problem. The U.S. is unambiguously the world's leader on a whole series of metrics having to do with the internet. And in addition to Richard's paper, which we're going to be talking about today, AEI is also releasing a paper by Brett Swanson, published this morning, available at techpolicydaily.com and on AEI's website, which looks at yet another metric of American success, which is the level of traffic, the amount of internet traffic, ultimately the output of the internet. How much information are people actually sending and receiving on the internet relative to other countries, where the U.S. stands far above every other country in the world, with the single exception of South Korea, which, as we all know, has some unique characteristics. So I've now talked enough, but I wanted to say those things as an introduction to Richard's work, which I think is the most comprehensive effort, at least recently, maybe ever, to look at the performance of broadband in the United States relative to other countries. And in this case, really a comparison to the G7 countries, which are, both the other most prosperous nations in the world, and in a sense are competitors economically, but also those that you would think would be most comparable in terms of populations and incomes and governance structures and so on and so forth. So I think it's an important piece of work. I'm delighted that we have Richard at AEI. The work that Richard is doing at AEI is important on a number of topics, and very pleased that we're able to release this major study today. So I'm going to turn it to Richard. Richard's going to talk for a few minutes, and then I'll come back and introduce our panelists. Richard.
Thanks for that introduction, and to everybody who decided they'd rather talk about broadband metrics than see another net neutrality food fight today. This is the second international study that I've done about comparing broadband in the U.S. to other countries. The first was an OECD study that I did while I was working with ITIF. And this one is different in a couple of senses. Because I'm working with a smaller group of countries, the G7, it's possible to do more of an in-depth analysis about the policy scenarios in the various countries, and get behind the metrics and kind of understand what they mean. And it's also a more comparable group. As Jeff said, if you survey, the entire roughly 200 different countries or things that function like countries around the world, you'll see that small countries produce some fairly amazing numbers on some of the broadband metrics, because it's sort of easier to make a really big impact in a small country with one project that's done by one company. But overall, the bulk of the internet use across the world takes place in the G7 countries, and so I think it's a good laboratory to study the effects that policy has on broadband quality. I believe that, let me see, I'm not,
as in all things, where are you aiming at?
yeah,
This one's moving.
technical issues, huh? Why does this matter? I mean, the next few slides don't have a lot of flashy pictures, so I can just kind of explain them. Internet policy, broadband policy, like any other public policy, really should be judged by its results. I mean, as a question of ideology, there's certainly a group of people that believe everything should be free market just in principle, and there's a group of people that believe, well, no, the government, this is too important to leave to the market, so the government should do it. And of course, the free market people believe, well, it's actually too important to be left to the government, so free market should do it. And so, how do you resolve these debates empirically? Because by now we've had enough experience with different policy models in different countries that are roughly comparable to be able to establish that if, which of these arguments are correct on an empirical basis. So if we're meeting our goals, our policy framework is working. But if alternate policy frameworks are actually producing better results than we're experiencing in the U.S., then, we need to understand why, whether those results are relevant to us, and, maybe change our framework. So I think the ideology predicts the results, but measurement actually shows what they are. It actually reveals them. And was kind of astounded. One of the reporters there, talked to a lot of reporters last week because of the president's gambit on Title II. And one of them asked me a question that kind of shocked me, like, well, if Title II, why not just go ahead and adopt it anyway, even if there's not a good reason to? What's the harm? And it kind of reminded me in the 60s, Abby Hoffman wrote a book called Revolution for the Hell of It. and I'm thinking maybe we need a book, Regulation for the Hell of It. And And it was just so astounding. It's like, well, it actually can cause it. You know, it can cause some damage to impose regulations that are unnecessary. Every regulation has side effects. Oh, okay. Here we are. Yeah, so we don't regulate, so for the fun of it, the PG-rated version. But we do have to understand that policy is not the only factor that matters. I mean, there are differences between countries that are questions of geography, demographics, inherited infrastructure. Language actually plays a big role because across the world, English-speaking people use the internet more heavily than non-English-speaking people do. I mean, in Western Europe, you know, despite the different local languages, an awful lot of people speak English. And there's these countries, hence the G7 is the select group. I'm going to skip over the regulatory models until we've looked at the data. And of course, some of the factors that shape our policy are the inherited regulatory systems. Because we had extensive cable in the US and Canada that wasn't very common in the rest of the world. Netherlands and Belgium also are a pair of countries that had extensive cable TV deployment, say in the late 90s. And these countries sort of inherited this tradition of actually two different regulatory models that are very different. So the common carriage model comes from most recently from telephone service, but cable TV as the TV service has never really been considered a common carrier. It's a private carriage system with negotiated interconnection. So the countries that had that policy legacy developed internet policies that tended to be different from countries that simply where their only communications infrastructure and policy system they inherited was telephony. And of course, in internet policy, there are, we're sort of crafting internet policy finally after 20 years of essentially operating under inherited policy frameworks. What role do government controls play on it? What role do internet norms play on it? I mean, there's certainly a lot of people who still argue that the internet has its own preference for regulation that's designed into maybe even into the structure of the protocols. Some of the net neutrality arguments actually say the end-to-end principle, which is central to the overall organization of the internet, dictates something about how the system should be regulated. And there are differences of opinion about how that would actually work, but it's an argument that says that it's a unique system. Certainly everybody who's been a big fan of the internet for the last 30 years has argued that the internet is different from the telephone system and better, right? You don't find much disagreement on that point within the internet's technical community. So that says that it deserves to have its own regulatory norms. And of course, the role of subsidies across the whole ecosystem, whether they're limited to R&D, whether they pay for rural deployment, or whether they actually pay to create something that looks like competition in urban markets, is a live question in many parts of the world. So how do we evaluate success? What I've done is I've taken, in the paper there are roughly 70 two charts and graphs and maybe one picture. Taking that and boiling it down into a little scorecard which has essentially 8 factors, 6 factors really, to determine who's winning and who's losing. One of those factors that I think is more important probably than anything else is the geographic handicap, which is it's even more substantial in Canada than it is in the US, but in the US and Canada together, we have a much greater geographic problem to overcome than, say, Japan does. So that's one, and so that's kind of a negative. You have to overcome that, and so I give extra credit to the countries that have a larger geographic handicap. So I'm concerned about one of the success factors is to what extent are we deploying advanced network technologies. And advanced network technologies in internet policy is generally being considered to be networks that have download speeds of 25 megabits per second or greater. So that's fast broadband, and there's ultra-fast broadband, sort of goes beyond that. That might be 100 megabits, it might be a gigabit. Those networks are not very widely deployed worldwide, so couldn't come up with a very meaningful assessment on that, but that's a goal. Smartphone adoption is something I think is important because this broadband isn't simply a wired system, it's also a mobile system, and you can't really achieve the benefits of mobile broadband if you don't own a smartphone. So how thoroughly are smartphones permeating in the population? And there's some very interesting discontinuities in the data actually between smartphone adoption and network utilization. Are people adopting high-end plans? And this is a question that Akamai has been asking, like before anybody else really even understood why it was important. One of the most valuable, probably what I consider the single most valuable metric in the Akamai database is what they call the high-speed broadband adoption. Yeah, high broadband adoption, which is currently, the bar for that is set at 10 megabits per second at the TCP level. And then the data volume that's being transferred that Jeff was talking about, it's a Cisco piece of data, and I'm very fortunate to have Akamai and Cisco's people on either side of me, so that if I'm misusing this data in any way, I'm sure they're not going to be shy about pointing that out, as I haven't been in the past.
We worked through that.
Yeah, and came to an understanding. So this is the overall scorecard. And what I did in each of these categories, instead of just sort of ranking the countries 1 through 7, because you'd actually get a lot of ties, what I found when I looked at the data was that it tended to be grouped into essentially 3 groups in each category. So in terms of the rural population, the next generation adoption, et cetera, you could see that there would be groups of countries that were very close together, and then maybe a big gap, and where the difference between 2 countries was greater than this gap, then I would consider those countries together. And there are some cases where we essentially had 5 countries in one category, and then 1 in the middle and 1 at the low end. But when you look at the raw data, which is in the report, you'll see that the grouping tends to fall out in a pretty natural way, I think, in most respects. There are a couple, I think, on mobile usage, there, US and Canada, you might run that a little differently, and if you did, your scores would come out somewhat differently. But essentially, the way the scorecard turned out, US and Canada seem to be outperforming the rest of the G7. Japan and the UK are doing a very credible job, in the middle. And then Germany, France, and Germany, France, and Italy are not doing that well. So, now there's a really extensive discussion about population distribution in the report that where I ended up creating this metric, the rural area per internet exchange, that I hadn't seen before. And also there's another population datum that's in there, which has to do with the density of the rural population by square kilometers of arable land, which is a common metric that's used in population studies. And that's a fascinating figure too, because the rural is defined as 1,000 people per square kilometer. The average density of the rural population in Japan is 993 people. So you basically don't have rural people in Japan. And you have to look at the arable land figure, because like some people have pointed out, well, that Sweden actually has a lower population density on average than the US does. But most of Sweden is completely uninhabited because, it's just ice. And it's like Alaska. So that's not really meaningful. Like the part where people actually live, that, what's the population density there? So if you take the square root of these numbers, you get an idea of how many miles of cable you have to run to connect people's homes to the internet. Oh, okay. Next generation coverage is obviously very high in Japan because there's been a nationwide campaign to wire all of Japan with fiber to the home. And this is achieved through a combination of incentives and tax subsidies and essentially total NGA penetration in Japan is 97% roughly. The urban population in Japan is 78% of the total population. But the rural NGA coverage in Japan is quite good. It's 78.4%. It's a lot better than it is in any other country. But obviously the US and Canada are doing well on this metric because essentially if you have cable modem service, you have next generation access, or you have the capability of next generation access. So the 82% of the US and the 80% of Canada that have next generation access without the addition of a single new wire, could be in the hundreds of megabits per second. And the UK does a lot better on this than I had really thought they would. But because it's mostly a DSL country, but UK, about half of the UK has access to cable. Germany has less cable than the UK does, but they also have, they're emerging quite a bit of VDSL in Germany. And France and Italy are not doing well there at all, which is not surprising. LTE coverage, of course, the US and Canada were the first countries to really implement LTE at scale. These were countries that had a lot of CDMA, which CDMA has never been legal in Europe. So the CDMA guys had an incentive to adopt LTE because they had kind of reached a wall with the capacity that CDMA would permit, and because of our regulatory frameworks, we were able to transform those CDMA networks into LTE networks without any regulatory action. But it took government action in the European Union before LTE was permissible, and new spectrum had to be assigned to it. And Japan was a little late with LTE, but they had actually 3.9G, so they had like a better quality 3G system than we did. Smartphone adoption, the data comes from two different sources, from the Bank of America Merrill Lynch mobile matrix, and also Google's, I think they call it My Mobile or My something, the name's in the report. USA and UK are roughly 1 and 2 on smartphone adoption. I didn't realize smartphones were that prevalent in the UK, but apparently a lot of people use the sort of standard usage mode for smartphones in the UK is a lot of text messaging over 3G networks. So it's not so much high data transfer, but it's it's nice to have a phone with that you can, BlackBerry type phone that you can do text messaging on. Now the figure that stands out here is especially in the Google on the red line, Japan only has 25% smartphone adoption. And what I've done for the most part in this study, by the way, is that I don't make a claim unless I can find two sources that are consistent that support the claim, because there are outliers in the data that's collected on this topic. And so, used to be a rule in journalism that you got to have two sources to confirm something. Well, Bob Woodward was on my plane when I flew out here, and that reminded me that some people have broken major stories with only one source, but it better be a good source, right? So this is an Akamai figure. The Akamai releases their report every quarter, and these are first quarter reports from 2 years apart, from 2014, 2013. What percentage of users are actually connecting to their content delivery networks at the TCP level at speeds above 10 megabits per second? And Japan's obviously got the highest figure there because they have fiber everywhere and cable modem in half the places, and that's what most people use. So they have the highest penetration, this is or the highest adoption of high-speed networking. But the U.S. has the second highest use of high-speed networking. But the U.S. and the U.K. and a lot of these metrics, the Akamai metrics, are very close. There's some actually where the U.K. leads the U.S. and there's some where it's slightly behind. But I was actually quite surprised to see how good the quality of broadband networks is in the UK compared to the US. And for a long time, Canada was head and shoulders above the UK, but not so much anymore. But bear in mind, the way the cable company in the UK, which is not subject to open access rules, by the way, Virgin, which is now owned by John Malone, the guy that brought you TCI cable. The way they market their services, the slowest package you can get from Virgin Media in the UK is 50 megabits. So they're positioning it against DSL. So if you want high-speed service in the UK, you go to cable, you get either a 50 megabit, 100 megabit, or 150 megabit plan. And they only serve the urban areas, so their costs are pretty low and their prices are quite attractive. Germany, has got low adoption of high-speed networks. To France and Italy are frankly, I think the technical term is pathetic. And the SAMNOS data that the European Union collects shows the same thing. Now, on the mobile side, it's a very different story, and I think it could be at least partially because the wired networks are so poor in France. There's the wireless networks are pretty decent. They're actually quite fast, and they're not as widely used as they are in the U.S. and the U.K. But another one of the data that I don't have on a slide here today is about web page load times. And according to the Akamai data, web pages load as fast on wireless networks in France as they do on wired networks. And that's certainly something that we don't see here. There's typically a really substantial penalty, when you go from a wired to a wireless network in most countries, but not in France. But they're starting with a really low baseline for their wired networks. So what I have here is average speeds, the peak to average ratio, and the percent penetration, which is above 4 megabits per second, which is comparable to that 10 megabit number for the wired networks. And 66% are connecting above 4 megabits per second at the TCP level, which means your overall network capacity is some multiple of that. In France, that's really quite impressive. The peak to average tells you how congested the networks are most of the time, and that's pretty interesting because I had thought the U.S. would probably have more congested wireless networks, but at 2.7, it's not that bad. Now we get into the really cool stuff, the internet traffic loads. And all these other things are measurements, but Cisco's actually measuring the future, so they already know what our utilization is going to be in 2017, that's pretty nice to know. If you can go to Vegas and place a bet on that.
It's great central planning.
Yeah. But they actually build the routers, so they control this, so they're in a position to know that. Yeah.
Plus or minus 10%.
Yeah, there you go. So utilization in the U.S., Canada, and the U.K., which happen to be 3 English-speaking countries, is highest in the world. The Italians are kind of so-so about the internet. I guess they, go to the cafe, you ride your Vespa, you say ciao, you drink a lot of espresso, and don't worry about the internet. But that's the scenario. And on mobile, in mobile, it's a different story, and this is pretty fascinating because Japan. I'm the kind of guy that really. I like baseball for the sabermetrics. I don't. Watching the game is kind of. It's fun to do, but it's really all about the numbers, dudes. And can you predict who's gonna win the World Series? But Japan's utilization of mobile data is really high, it's quite impressive given that smartphone adoption is not that prevalent in Japan. And I've asked people from Japan, that study these things, why that's the case. And they believe one of the prime drivers is the morning commute into Tokyo, because so much of the Japanese population works in Tokyo, and they ride commuter trains for like over an hour. And unlike the subways in the United States, they have seamless connectivity from end to end of that for the whole hour that they're on that commute. So they're watching videos on the train, while they're coming into work, and I think that probably that's enough to drive the numbers up. There are a lot of other factors that I'll probably do a short paper that does an alternate scorecard with a more comprehensive list of factors, things like the investment rate, the upgrade rate, consumer prices, and all that. But my scorecard was kind of limited to what fits on a page and is still readable, so I haven't done that yet. Now, going back to the policy frameworks, what I found something about regulatory models that I didn't know before I'd done the report, because everybody hears it's like, well, we have facilities-based competition in the U.S., but everybody else has open access. Well, it turns out that open access thing in the rest of the world is not as black and white as you might think it is. Because what is really it is, as a blanket statement, I think you could say that in most of the world, open access to DSL, to the telephone network, is a norm. And the number of countries that have deviated from that is pretty small. But you cannot say that open access to cable is a norm throughout the world, because it just simply isn't. And OECD has actually written a paper on this about open access in broadband. And look, in the entire OECD, there are only 2 countries that have any history of open access to cable, and that's Denmark and Canada doesn't have it anymore. And this is bitstream level open access because of not direct to the wire because of the topology. And throughout the world, the cable modem networks outperformed DSL. So, what does this tell us? Well, and it turns out that in the fiber world, there's a very similar kind of situation where regulatory bodies in different countries, and despite the fact that Europe is supposed to have a common regulatory model, each country in Europe is regulated by a national regulator according to national laws that are supposed to transpose the European Union-wide standards into national law, and they all do it differently. And there are a lot of studies that show, what the subtle differences are between European countries and how they've transposed the access directives from 2000 and 2002 into local law. The net result of this is that to incentivize the incumbent carrier to build out fiber to the home or to VDSL, there are various means of relaxing the open access requirements to incentivize the carrier to do that. Everything ranging from regulatory holidays, like BT has asked Ofcom to do that in the UK, to just basically give them 3 years off of the open access requirement for fiber to the home, in which they're the sole supplier. And the more nuanced approach that Japan has adopted is that there's an open access rule for fiber in Japan, but you can only lease fiber 8 strands at a time, which makes it extremely difficult to offer a competitive ISP. Consequently, NTT East and NTT West, the incumbent that pulled all the fiber, has 71% of the market for fiber to the home services in Japan. In Korea, that's a similar figure. Korea Telecom has 67% of that market. So effectively, it's a combination of a carrot and a stick. So the regulator says, you don't want your fiber to be treated the way we've done with your DSL, essentially made it impossible for you to profit from DSL. But you can make big profits on fiber if you do that, because we'll protect you from competition, essentially. And the countries that perform the best actually they tend to have 3 sets of facilities. They have fiber, cable, and DSL. on the wired side, and on the wireless side, they have essentially freedom to upgrade to new technologies. So that's pretty much the key takeaway, that the policy models have a huge impact, and the policy models are a lot more subtle than we've more or less been led to believe. There's definitely a movement away from wired broadband connections in a lot of countries to mobile networks. That's what people want. And the prices that people pay really are related to the costs of operating the networks. And the bottom line is the U.S. broadband regulatory framework is not really crying out for major change. I mean, this is what I discovered. It's, I think, what the data say. You may disagree with me, but, you know, I've published the data. The charts and graphs are there in the paper. Everything is sourced, everything multiply sourced when possible. So, you know, read it and you can draw your own conclusions.
Richard, I think all of us would go on off your fifth point in our own directions. But what's your second and third sentence there? What are you thinking when you talk about arbitrary goals being overruled by consumers?
Well, countries that tend to establish national goals for broadband will like Japan. The regulator in Japan said, we want to have the fastest network in the world. And so we want 100 megabits, and then eventually we want a gigabit. And that's what people should have. The regulator's opinion about what people should have is not always the same as people's opinion about what they should have.
Proving it was a good question, because that's not how I would have interpreted that, but it's a great answer. So Susan's been over there.
Richard, are you
Yeah, so I'm done. Yeah. Oh, those are two different things. So yeah, it's excuse me. Let me look at that. Yeah, the chart is a bit confusing because, let me stretch this thing out so I can see it.
which page?
Total NG, it's, yeah.
Roman 8.
So I have total NGA, which is NGA access, but then urban population is what percentage of the country's population is urban. So it's not actually a function of either of the other two numbers. No, rural NGA is what's the NGA in the rural areas. You got to read the paper.
All right.
Yeah, this is the back of the baseball card. You got to look at the front of the chart. Yeah.
Well, Richard, thank you. And I think everybody, what we just got is sort of a scratching of the surface of what is a very substantial piece of research with lots of data, and reading the paper is exactly right. I'm going to ask each of our commenters to talk for not more than 5 minutes, and less if you choose. We have four real experts here to talk about both the policy and the data aspects of this. Jonathan Banks and I'm going to keep my introductions extremely brief, Jonathan Banks from U.S. Telecom, David Belson from Akamai, who's Senior Director of Industry and Data Intelligence, Jeff Campbell from Cisco, who is also a Senior Director in Technology and Trade Policy and Global Policy at Cisco, and Ev Ehrlich, who, among other positions, is at the Progressive Policy Institute and President of ESC, Company and Economic-Based Consulting Firm. So I think we're going to just go down the row, skipping Richard, and then we're going to open things up and both to the panel and to the audience.
All right, well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Richard, and thanks for having me here. I'd just like to say a couple things, and one is, I don't know if you need to read Richard's report, but you need to keep it on your bookshelf because it is an extremely valuable compendium of information. There are a lot of studies that look at price, and there are a lot of studies that look at NGA architecture, a lot of studies that look at this and that. But his takes a couple of looks at each one of those areas and puts it all together in one place. So it's something you can pull off your shelf. If you want to know about price, it's there. If you want to know about density, it's there. It's an extremely valuable resource. So I really highly recommend it. And I think it does a real service to the whole debate to have something out there like this that is well researched and very broad. I think the tie to regulatory models is pretty fascinating. And, you know, telecom is a complex industry, and you can never say any one thing about it that's actually completely accurate. But his reduction to that simple scorecard is a way to really get a message across about how policies matter and what they matter to, both speed, price, and all that. And I think that should be a really important part of our debate as we go forward with, you know, the open internet proceeding and Title II and the transition to IP networks. This is all factual information that the FCC needs and is about to act on. Well, maybe not about to act on the facts, but about to act in these areas. And I think the more we can bring these facts to their attention, the better. And I think one of the most powerful things you get out of Richard's study is that in places where consumer demand can lead markets, you know, it leads it in a way that fits for the country and will produce next generation architectures as people want and need them. And I think some of the most interesting data about it is the usage data from Cisco. And at US Telecom, we took some of that data and tried to divide it by internet users, subscribers in each of the G7 countries and broader. And when you look at per capita internet usage, the US, as Richard said, is a world leader. And it's hard to think of a better single measure, I think, of the value and sufficiency of networks than usage. Usage is really what people are getting out of the networks. And usage here is very, very high. As Richard mentioned, South Korea is a little bit higher. The US is likely to surpass South Korea in the next couple of years. And I think the South Korea numbers are really a function of the method that they consume video, not so much over a cable network, but through downloading and et cetera. So I think this is a fabulous study. I think it has a lot of important policy implications that are really front and center today at the FCC.
So wanted to thank Richard for inviting me to participate today. And what I wanted to do was provide just some additional context around some of the measurements that Richard included in his paper, and a little bit of background just on Akamai for those of you that are not as familiar with us. Every quarter we publish the State of the Internet report. I'm the primary author and editor of that content. And it leverages data that's derived from what we call our intelligent platform. As of the end of Q3, we had over 160,000 servers located in over 2,600 locations around the world, over 1,200 networks, 95 countries, and processing or handling on the order of 2 trillion content requests a day. So that means that we're processing and analyzing on the order of 150 to 200 trillion content requests a quarter for the data that goes into the report. Richard leveraged a number of our metrics within the report, and I want to just provide some background on how we calculate them. The average connection speed, basically what we're doing each quarter is taking all of the content requests that we see from a given geography, state, or country level, and averaging the speeds of those all together. So when we service a content request, we log a number of things, including the size of the file and the amount of time it took to deliver that file. And that gives us a connection speed for that particular request. You know, one of the caveats there is that the average connection speeds can be impacted by a number of factors, including parallel requests. So browsers today make 3 or 4 or 5 requests at the same time. Small files, so you don't have the opportunity to ramp that connection up to its peak speed if you're delivering just a small GIF or a small CSS file. And IP address sharing, so you have one IP address at your house, you have multiple users, multiple devices. If those are all making requests for content from Akamai at the same time, we're going to see a lower effective speed for that given IP address. Conversely, the average peak speed, what we're doing is for all of the measurements we get from a given IP address in a particular country or state, we're just averaging together just the fastest ones. And these measurements tend to be associated with larger file downloads when the connection has the time to ramp up and reach sort of its full capacity, its full peak speed. And then within the report, in order to provide a little more of a level playing field, if you will. More than 25,000 unique IP addresses, unique IPv4 addresses, I should say, we need to see from a given country over the course of the quarter. And this is ultimately to prevent, the Vatican from ranking number 1 or number 2 as compared to the US. You can't really compare the 6 unique IPs we see there from the 130 million or so we see from the US. And as Richard mentioned, there are several adoption metrics that we published as well. High broadband is the percentage of connections to Akamai at speeds over 10 megabits a second. Broadband is the percentage of connections at speeds over 4 megabits a second. And a new one that we've rolled out starting in 2014 is what we're calling 4K ready. And this is really, looking at, as 4K video grows, what are the countries, what are the states that are going to be best positioned to be able to consume that? There's no industry standard on 4K right now. Depending on who you talk to, they talk about it being anywhere between 10 and 20 megabits a second for encoding rates. So we kind of settled in the middle of that, and we look at those numbers each quarter. And similarly, 25,000 unique IPv4 addresses connecting to Akamai to be considered for inclusion in those metrics. I won't go into the next few slides in detail. You can generate your own graphs at stateoftheinternet.com. But wanted to kind of expand on and show some trends, expanding on what Richard showed in the paper. And what we see here, and in retrospect, when I put the slides together, I probably shouldn't have ranked them on change over time. It was interesting to me, but listening to Richard previously, recognizing, I think we probably should be looking at where they wound up most recently. What we see is, at least looking at change over time from that perspective, the U.S. is, second only to the UK, and frankly, when you look at the average connection speeds overall, it comes in second only to Japan. Looking at the average peak speeds, so from a change over time perspective, sits somewhat in the middle of the G7, but again, ranks also kind of in the middle of the pack, led by Japan, but then also behind the UK, but ahead of Canada and Germany. For high broadband adoption trends over time, so looking at the percentage of connections at speeds over 10 megabits, significant growth, and clearly much better than Italy and Japan. But to be fair, Japan had a huge head start and is still significantly ahead in terms of the average connection speeds among the G7. And for broadband, obviously one of the lower changes over time over the last 7 years, but it also it winds up sitting in the middle of the pack. The U.S. winds up being in the middle of the pack in terms of broadband adoption rates. But to be fair, also it started out with the second highest rate, so the growth was the growth rate is a little bit lower. Richard also showed 1 quarter of data for the mobile connections. And what I wanted to highlight here was just the trends over time. So previously, up until the beginning of this year, we had published mobile data on an anonymized network basis. So looking at it on a more granular level, we changed the way that we identify mobile networks earlier this year, and ultimately wound up with way too many networks to publish in the report, so we started aggregating it at a country level, similar to what we do for the wired networks, the fixed networks. So the thick orange line here is the US. You can see that for average connection speed on mobile connections, we start out at the beginning of 2013 with one of the highest average connection speeds, or actually, sorry, the highest average connection speed. And we wind up second only to, I believe, Canada at the end of Q2. But you can see that the growth rate is approximately the same. With the mobile peak connection speed measurement, you can see we start out a little bit lower, and the growth rate really isn't quite as significant as the other G7 countries. We're still lagging a bit there. Richard also referenced within the paper a statement from the FCC Measuring Broadband America report, talking about how at speeds over a certain threshold, the problems are really more with the browsers and the servers, and the higher connection speeds won't make a significant difference. To address that, obviously, there's a whole market around content and application delivery networks that has grown up over the last 15 years. Akamai obviously is a key player there. And the participants in that market are implementing technologies like front-end optimization, manipulating the content such that it downloads faster. Working with advanced protocols, so HTTP2, the next evolution of HTTP, as well as other technologies that have been spearheaded by Google, like Speedy and Quick. What we're seeing now also is a really rapid browser update, release and adoption cycle. Akamai has some data on that I didn't include here, but what we're seeing is as Chrome and as Firefox push out new versions that support new capabilities and new technologies, there's a fairly quick ramp up and a fairly quick ramp down of the older versions. So just to summarize, again, we're really pleased that Richard and others have chosen to leverage Akamai's State of the Internet Report data as a key resource. But we are, just one of the resources there in terms of, broadband speed and adoption data. As Richard mentioned, SAMNOS is out there, UCLA is out there, so there are other sources. Average connection speed growth rate in the U.S. has been higher than the rest of the G7. The peak growth rate has been kind of middling. With the high broadband rate, the growth has been aggressive, though not so much as in the other G7 countries. Broadband growth has been one of the lower, the U.S. has been one of the lower growth rates as compared to the other G7 countries. And as I mentioned, the average connection speed growth rates for mobile were in line with other G7 countries, but with the average peak mobile connection speed has been a little bit lower growth rate.
Great, thanks for being here today. Let me just start with a quick note on some of the research and projections we do at Cisco. We do 3 major projections a year, 2 of which are under our Visual Networking Index, which we've been doing for quite some time, one for overall internet traffic and one for mobile internet traffic. And we've also, in recent years, added a 3rd issue called our Cloud Readiness Index, which is focused on the ability of the networks to support cloud services and Internet of Things services as well. Our research is both a combination of current numbers, as in what was the actual traffic in a year, but also we project out 5 years. We've now been doing this long enough that we can look back 5 years to see whether we were right or wrong. And we've been generally about plus or minus 10% on these projections. And generally, we've actually underestimated the growth. The growth has been stronger than our previous projections. It's all available on the web and to anybody, and we make it available to researchers, and we have our people assist researchers with detailed data if they're looking for it as well, so that people like Richard can use the data and come to good conclusions or interesting conclusions on the basis of that. But I don't want to dwell too much on the data. I want to dwell a little more on what it means. Because I think the thing to understand about sort of global competitiveness or differences in global internet infrastructure and availability to consumers is driven really by 3 things. 1 is technology, 2 is geography, and 3 is policy. And I'm not sure what order to put those in, but I hate to say it to Washington here, I'm not sure that policy is number 1 in the driver here. Couple comments on technology. Just look at the history of how internet broadband services rolled out around the world, and you can see the impact of technology. The US was first out of the gate. It tended to have the best stuff. It was largely cable modem oriented at the very beginning, often providing 4 to 6 megabit service. DSL at the time was running around 1.5 megabits or less, and places that were dependent on twisted pair to provide broadband were behind places that had the availability of coaxial cable. The technologies in both areas have developed greatly since then, but at the end of the day, coaxial cable just has dramatically more capacity than twisted pair. And so there are big advantages to that, but they come and go as we've grown in the marketplace. Improvements in DSL technology means that it's, there's widely available 20, 25 megabit DSL services now. The technology can be scaled to 50 and 100 megabits depending on loop lengths and issues like that. But the capacity on a coaxial cable, with today's technology is somewhere around 4 gigabits. So it's just in a different category there. And I think that's something that everybody has to look at. Also, the availability of fiber is a big issue in that as well. Likewise, on the mobile side, the availability of fiber to the towers is probably one of the biggest constraints beyond spectrum. So that also can impact that. Leads me to my second point, which is geography matters enormously in this. All you have to do is get on a plane and fly from Dulles to Frankfurt, and you will see it with your own eyes. If you're flying into Dulles, what do you see out in Loudoun County? You see a bunch of 3-acre, McMansions of people escaping inner Washington and sitting in traffic every day. Very spread out, not dense at all. A lot of the rural land has been occupied that way. And even when you get into the more suburban areas there, it's still, single family houses, not all right on top of each other. You fly into Frankfurt and you look out the window, what do you see? You see fields of wheat, fields of wheat, fields of wheat, and then all of a sudden, apartment buildings and houses built all right next to each other. Even in the most rural areas, there's incredible density. Most of the world lives that way, not the way that we live here in the US. And that makes an enormous difference, because when you're growing DSL technology, you can drive very quickly to some fairly high speeds because you have short loop lengths and low cost for doing that. So we had a phase, in the early to mid 2000s where everyone was talking about how Europe has better broadband. It's better, it's better, it's better. Well, a lot of that was driven by the technology and the geography, not the policy. Now, as we're trying to go above that 20-25 meg level, all of a sudden the availability of cable systems, build out of fiber to the home makes a huge difference, because it's harder to get DSL to go up to that, to go to that level. So these are things I think we have to think about as we go forward. Certainly government policy has enormous implications. In this country, if we had continued to regulate the telephone companies the way that we were regulating them in the 90s, if we had not made that change, there is no doubt in my mind we would not have had the build out of FiOS. It just wouldn't have happened. And because we made a smart policy choice, there was an enormous deployment of fiber to home over a large sector of our country. There was also a lot of other investment in networks that was allowed. The fact that the cable companies never faced any of this regulation meant that they have been continually and consistently investing in their technology to deliver very high-speed broadband as the market demands it. The capability for them to provide a gigabit exists, but the investment only makes sense when consumers actually want and need the gigabit capacity. And today we're seeing that they like the 20 megabit capacity, and some of them are buying the 100 megabit capacity, but there's not a whole lot of demand for that. And as the demand comes there, the network will be able to provide it going forward. And those are policy choices, and they matter a whole lot. I think that gets me at about 6 minutes. So I'm gonna stop on that point. But I think it is very important that when we look at all this data, and a lot of our data on the speeds in the actual countries, quite frankly, are really within margin of error differences. The Asian countries have faster fixed numbers. The US has some pretty good mobile numbers. In Europe, the US is ahead of some of the countries, it's behind some of the countries, and in some of them it's ahead in fixed and behind in mobile, and other it's vice versa. Italy is kind of following the pack by quite a distance. But to argue that a specific policy choice made these very big differences, it's the combination of a whole bunch of things here, and I think we have to think about it that way.
Let me, yeah, I see. It's a great day if Ehrlich is the last guy in the alphabetical. You don't get that on a panel that often. Jonathan's first sentence should also be the last, that this is one you have to keep on your shelf, because there's just so much, to use a technical term, crap that goes on in making these kinds of comparisons. And I also think that there's good judgment was exercised in the first sentence of how you would distill and summarize this paper, which is the legacy of cable creates two kinds of goodness. First, it creates platform competition, and second, it creates a mindset that it is possible to have information flow to the home outside of the common carriage mode. The first panel, I'm going to toss away one of my 5 minutes. The first panel that I was ever on in this area was, in fact, with Dr. Eisenach. It was right after Obama's election. He's probably crowing about that now because I called him a sore loser that day. But Jeff, I'm going to keep voting for Obama until he gets it right. But regardless, we were on with, I think it was Mark Cooper. And I remember saying that Mark was in favor of the barnacles competing for a piece of the whale, and that I was in favor of the whales competing for a piece of the ocean. And that was the difference between the common carriage and platform competition models. And afterwards, he came up to me and he said, you know, the cable guys never thought about this. They were just thinking about TV. And I wanted to be a gentleman, so I did not say, I guess you don't use Viagra. Because Viagra was invented to lower blood pressure. And I guess that since it wasn't invented for any other use, you wouldn't use it for any other use, you blithering idiot. So that goes to one set of remarks. A second is that when I got the paper, I thought this is long, and when I read it, I said this is way too short. There's the possibility of doing all sorts of interesting things here. Richard is already well on the way towards developing a dashboard of measurements about broadband. But I wondered and tried to start doing it on my own, but time and my imagination limited me. How do I, for example, contrast where the 7 nations are on price versus utilization, or geographic measures versus pass rates or penetration? How do we develop a better measures of some of these? I take issue, Richard was saying that geographic hardships or overcoming them is a goal or measure of success. It is something that gives us a contextual view about the other measures of success, but you've done very well if that's the most blithering criticism you received today. When I was writing what was a pale imitator of not only this paper, but his previous one at ITIF, comparing the G7, I tried to coax the data into giving me, in essence, a Gini coefficient for population density, and seeing if I could boil that data down to one number that I could then use as an explanatory variable about cost. Time, and more time than data limitations, stopped me from doing that. The census's Tiger file, for example, would give you population by block in the U.S., and you could construct a Gini coefficient for population density in the U.S. There's room for a lot of different methodological improvement there, and that, I think, goes to the second remark that I would make, and that is that there is still more than ample room for a paper that doesn't make these comparisons, but that discusses the methodological issues of making those comparisons. Richard made a point that I would paraphrase in the following way, that when you discuss interest rates, someone said, what's the interest rate? I would say, which one? Because there's a yield curve. And the same thing is true. What's the price of a connection? Well, which one? Because there's a structure of connections. And there's this terrible temptation, as he has pointed out in this paper and in others, to look at the price per meg, right, and price per speed, which is a wholesale refutation of the law of diminishing returns. Now, when I ran the statistical system, BEA was a pioneer in thinking about this, because it had to deal with things like computers and automobiles and telephones, and it had to look at ongoing technological improvement, and it uses a hedonic technique based on model matching, since we do have, for example, the introduction of widespread 100 meg to the home is happening at a time when there is already widespread 20 meg to the home, and we can look at the two and chain together some kind of an index. There are possibilities there to look at a hedonic approach to this kind of connectivity, and there's a lot of room for a broader discussion and a more popular discussion about these methodological issues, because in part, we agonize when advocates for Title II, for example, or the thing for which I think it's a stalking horse, a rate-based public utility internet, whatever that's going to look like, talk about how, in essence, the internet's really like the phone system, and which is kind of like saying the birds are like the dinosaurs because they came out of the same lineage, or Cream is like the Nat King Cole trio because they both had three guys and they counterposed themselves to the big bands. But a lot of what you see, for example, this nonsense about how in Tallinn they get a better deal than they do in Cincinnati, and we're supposed to put our heads under the pillow and go, save us. That it's based on the underlying assumption of, well, it's all the same stuff, right? It's like the phone system. You dial it up and so on, and you don't have to worry about the rest, about where it came from, how it get there, what it does, right? What its availability is and the like. There really is that assumption. It underlies far more than simply the debate over Title II. And some of it has to do with public naivete about the engineering details, and it's good to have a very competent engineer like Richard talking about these things. And I know that he's a very competent engineer, not just from his own work, but some of his sentence constructions. But the methodology that's required to make adequate comparisons about price and about speed and the like are not in the least widely understood. They were kind of collateral to the thrust here, and there is room for people whose competence is like Richard's or someone else's but not mine, to talk about what those methodological issues are and make them more widely understood. Richard, I close with just two questions. On page 42, open signal LTE speed has the U.S. declining by 50% in the last year. That's pretty hokey. What's going on there? Does it have to do with the fact that it appears to be the outlier in these comparisons on page 43? And then I've got LTE coverage in France that's minimal, and smartphone adoption that's kind of median, and yet the greatest percentage of 4 meg and better. Now, I get to 4 meg on 3G, and maybe that's the story, but my dog-eared pages, brother. What's going on in those 2 points?
So I don't want to gazump you here, Richard, but there's one stat that will help answer this, and then I'll let Richard talk more about this. We also track LTE usage, and in 2013, well, first of all, part of why it went down was people actually started using it. Mm-hmm. It's amazing what happens to speed when people use, but we track global usage of these things. In 2013, 49% of all LTE connections in the world were in the United States. It's just on a totally different point on the adoption curve.
Yeah, in most countries, LTE is an extra cost feature. So in the UK and in Europe, for the most part, you have to pay extra to get LTE. So not that many people use it. Consequently, there's a lot of unused capacity and the network speeds are high.
Huh. Cool.
So it's just like Wi-Fi in an airport.
Right.
More people use it, the slower it gets.
Solid. Thank you.
Richard, I want to ask you very briefly, like in a couple of minutes, to respond to anything you heard, and just one question I'd like you to just take on squarely is the one that kind of Ev was hitting at the end. There is some other research out there at the New America Foundation, other places, which suggests that the U.S. is running way behind. And I'd like you to just very briefly kind of address why you think. Based on your research, I assume you think that research isn't coming to the right conclusions.
Okay. The Open Technology Institute, which is part of the New America Foundation, does a study every year called the Cost of Connectivity. that's based on advertising surveys in some 10 international cities and some number of 15 or 20 American cities and also American towns like Bristol, Virginia, where they look at advertised speeds and advertised prices and essentially determine a cost per megabit per second in different places. And they generalize from, say, London. So the data is collected at the city level, but the conclusions they make are at the country level. So they generalize the whole state of the UK from the London figures, and they generalize the whole state of the US from New York, San Francisco, Washington, and LA, and then 4 small towns. I mean, it's not an apples to apples comparison, and of course these are ads, right? I mean, do you believe everything you read in an ad? When the FCC has made an issue with the SAMNO study of validating the accuracy of the ads that American broadband suppliers run. And in the most recent study, they say that overall, the carriers in the U.S. outperform. The up to rates in the ads are deceptive because we're actually achieving more than the up to rates. But in Europe, the SAMNO's tests indicate that people in Europe get about 75% of what's advertised. Japan and Korea won't even publish. They do SAMNO studies in those countries. They don't publish the results because they'd be so embarrassing. There have been some anecdotal studies. A professor that I cite in the paper has used speed tests to do studies in Japan, and they find out that you may actually be getting as little as 35% of the advertised rate in Japan. And it's not because the last mile signaling is slow, but there's congestion behind the last mile that is driving the speeds down. And in Korea, there are 2 backbones. There's a premium backbone that's the fast lane, and then there's a generic backbone that's the slow lane that most of the services run in. So if you want to do video in Korea, you have to use the premium backbone. So it's just the most superficial study I think that someone could possibly do, because advertising is not accurate. Advertising doesn't reflect the prices that people are paying for the plans that they bought 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago.
Okay, well, with that, we've got about 10 minutes before we conclude, and I'm just going to open it up to questions from anybody either around the table or in the audience. So raise your hand, and we've got mics so that folks listening online will also be able to hear the conversation. Otherwise, I've got more questions. Here we go, Paul.
Well, I always figure I'll ask a first question while the smart people think about their questions. So here goes. I haven't been able to read the paper yet, but I look forward to it. So quick question would be, do you look at upload speeds, and does that materially matter across the G7? The second question is that policy question, and that is, you talked about extra points for geography, and one could say that we have a confiscatory policy to help rural America by wiring them up. Is that something we should have for broadband? Is that important, or should rural folks have to kind of fend for themselves?
On the first question, I don't look at upload rates because it doesn't seem to be the constraining factor in the way that people use broadband. It's the ratio of download to upload traffic in basically every computer network I've studied for 30 years has been at least 4 to 1, if not 10 to 1 or 100 to 1. You click one link and you see an entire movie from Netflix. So the ratio of upload to download traffic is like 10,000 to 1 or something. So don't look at that. The question of rural subsidies is sort of beyond the scope of this kind of paper, but there is that's a subject I know that Jonathan has some opinions about. And it's worth studying, but it's not something that I really address in any detail in the paper.
I mean, I would just say for the rural subsidy part, I think we're past due for updating the way we subsidize rural connections. And, we have always had a strong policy in the country for universal telephone connections and universal electricity. So I think, delivering broadband connections in a smart way to rural areas makes sense, and it connects all those people to markets and job possibilities and education possibilities. So I think a well-tailored fund, which the FCC is trying to do, at least for one half of the fund, makes sense.
We have a question back here.
Hi, yes, Judith Hellestein, Hellestein Associates. Very interesting study. I was wondering, you had mentioned that you only looked at IPv4 addresses, and I was wondering if you had looked at any, was there any substantial IPv6 addresses, and how many does that take to get into your study?
Sure. So we're starting to roll in more IPv6 data. I was hoping to be able to start including IPv6 speeds as part of our upcoming Q3 report, but it looks like it'll probably hit closer to Q1 2015, so starting next year. We've started to collect the data, but we haven't dug into it deeply yet. So, given things like privacy addressing and issues like that, where we may see a significantly higher number of V6 addresses, we don't have a specific threshold there yet. For the first few years that we published the report, our threshold was actually, what was it? I think it was 1,000 IPv4 addresses to qualify for inclusion. But again, we went up comparing these, incredibly small, European and Southern Pacific island nations with, the G7 countries. It just really, the comparisons didn't make the same amount of sense. So, we're looking at, what is that threshold for IPv6? I think another part of the challenge that we're figuring out how to address as well is the geolocation of IPv6 addresses. IPv4 geolocation is a pretty well understood problem and a fairly well solved problem. V6, because it's still a very Swiss cheesy kind of network connection. Or sorry, there are islands of V6 connectivity, I should say. It's a little bit harder to pin down exactly where those V6 addresses are. So, but we did just release V6 adoption statistics on our State of the Internet website, and we hope to have speed-specific insight coming next year.
Other questions from the floor? Richard, I've got one, and this maybe hints at, I think, a future paper coming down the road, but I think there's a lot of data in this. So I think our instinct is to compare ourselves to other countries, other industrial nations here. But the other question that I think is sometimes kind of gets lost in the discussion is comparison over time, the time series. I guess my prior on that is I think about the internet I use today and think about the internet I was using 10 years ago and the internet I was using 20 years ago when when my first was using Netscape for the first time. It's a very different exercise, and a lot of that goes into broadband. So can you talk a little bit about the growth of broadband capacity, capability, speed, the change in the network over time?
Yeah, I mean, the internet, it's sort of been through a series of progressions where they're kind of defined by what the dominant app is at the time. When I started using the internet in the 70s, the dominant app was email. And then there were things that were kind of built on email, like Usenet, which is sort of like a kind of a group email kind of thing. And then we had FTP, Archie, Veronica, Gopher, which are file location and retrieval systems. And Gopher, I think, sort of evolved into the web, because with Gopher you had links. So World Wide Web is basically Gopher with graphics. Or another way to put it is it's actually the next computer's desktop extended across the network. If you've ever seen the desktop on the next computer that Steve Jobs was involved in during his sabbatical from Apple, and that is actually the system that Tim Berners-Lee, that was his desktop at CERN, was a Next. And it's a fairly straightforward evolution when you see what that desktop is like, and you click on things, and you have files are linked together within the system. The idea of extending that metaphor across a network is pretty straightforward. So, but now, I mean, the big data consumption app is video streaming, and video streaming is, as Dave points out, you know, even with 4K, you know, 15 megabits is gonna make that happen. And so I'm curious about what applications could emerge that will need the gigabit networks that you know, people are deploying in other countries and in parts of the U.S. In Denver, where I live, CenturyLink has announced they're going to deploy gigabit. They've already started. Some neighborhoods in Denver can already get gigabit from CenturyLink without a dime of subsidy. What kind of apps are those going to be? And, you know, when I think about just sort of, you run the numbers on how many video streams you'd have to consume a gigabit, and what kind of apps would organize, need multiple video streams at the same time, well, holograms are one of them. I mean, and people laugh because it sounds completely absurd, but, you know, if you told your grandfather when he was a kid that someday he'd be communicating with his insurance company through email, you know, you would have got a funny reaction too. But yeah, so things like that, gaming. I mean, as far as I can tell, the main Korea has the most, you know, really ultra high speed connections in the world. The application that seems to be really using those in Korea is gaming, and it's got to such an extent. I mean, computer gaming is a national sport in Korea. Like, people watch it on TV the way we do the Super Bowl here. And in fact, the Korean legislature right now is considering a gaming addiction law to deal with the problem that, like, people find these virtual environments more compelling than real life. And that can be a problem if your economy and your education still takes place in the real world. You know, you got to flip that switch. So we'll always find ways to use it.
That issue about looking at intertemporal comparisons came up here on page 48. You talk about Robert Miller's canonical human factors piece. You know, news to me, probably canonical. And one question that in order for things to work, you've got to have a lag time no greater than a couple of seconds. But there's another instantaneous threshold of 0.2 of a second that no networks support as a rule right now, and that, of course, in a neutral world you won't get. There is an interesting question about how fast does that gigabit network provide ubiquitous, quote-unquote, instantaneous. There's another question that I sort of derived out of that, is that when Tim Wu first came up with neutrality and the idea of a fast lane, quote-unquote, 8 years ago? Right? 12? Oh, okay, there you go. I would have to think that fast lane 12 years ago was the speed of what is going on ubiquitously here today. Much that when I hear that the U.S. is, 9th or 10th in Akamai ratings, thinking if I took that back to 2012, what century am I in? That would be first, second, or third, and that temporal dimension is far more important in making the argument and in developing understanding that not really so much 9th, but I'm about 20 months behind the global leader, much like the fast lane that we're accused of trying to architect is the equivalent of what everyone has today.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can't resist interjecting this, and then probably I think we'll wrap up. But on that point, I was recently involved in a testifying before the CRTC up in Canada, and the Competition Bureau came in saying we need to have a 4th wireless carrier in Canada, and we'll do, even though we can't. Nobody can demonstrate that a 4th wireless carrier would earn a profit and be economically viable. We want to have one anyway. And the reason we want to have one is we've got this econometric study, and the econometric study shows that it would lower retail prices by 2%. That's about 3 months worth of price decline. Right? So the CRTC is in the middle of a 2-year proceeding, the objective of which is to achieve 3 months worth of price decline.
They wanted a zombie to play bridge.
Right. So, what did we used to talk about, operating at internet speed versus speed in
Government speed.
the material world? So regulatory authorities haven't caught up with that. Listen, I want to thank everyone for being here today. I want to thank everyone who's listened online. Richard, this is a great paper. All of our commenters, excellent points and excellent comments. And onward and upward. Hopefully the facts will prevail at some point in all this.
Can always hope.